Great. Thank you, Elif. It's wonderful to be here today. Even with all the snow, I'm used to this from the Pacific Northwest. But as I was sitting here listening to Elif, it reminded me that the very first professional talk which I ever gave was in 1997 for Erit. So this sort of feels like coming around full circle. I was terrified. But if you went to that lecture, I got everything completely wrong. So tonight is my opportunity to correct the record and to explain to you the work that I've been doing at Gordion. Let me just also say I'm very grateful to Erit and the BIA for bringing me here, as well as the conference we'll be doing this weekend. I hope you will tune in for that. I think it's going to be some really terrific papers. So it is very nice to be here, and my subject today is going to be Gordion, but a Gordion that is perhaps not as well known to many of you. That is a later Gordion, the Gordion of the Roman period. Many of you, I think, have been to Gordion or know Gordion, located just a little left to center, as we like to say, in Turkey, not too far away from Ankara. The site has been excavated, for a very short time in 1900, but more or less continuously, or at least work has continuously been conducted there since 1950, first under Rodney Young and then under a series of his successors, presently under Brian Rose, for many of you who've been to the site. So we have a long history of excavation, and there's a lot going on at the site. For anybody who hasn't been there in some time, you would be quite amazed at what the last, say, 10 or 15 years has brought us. New excavations have uncovered a completely new gate in the Phrygian fortifications. There has been a mapping project, which we badly needed for many years. So much was excavated in a relatively short period of time that we really needed to work on this. And we have done all kinds of geoprospection as well. And this has yielded some really wonderful results. Brian Rose has been overseeing this, and most recently in the Gordion newsletter, there was a terrific new model of what Gordion looked like in the Phrygian period. And for those of you unfamiliar, we've discovered things over the years, such as the actual course of the Sicaria, which was on the other side of the mound than it is today. We've discovered new fortifications reaching quite out far to the west. It was a much, much larger and more complicated site than we had really believed. And so our knowledge of Gordion has grown quite a bit. Rodney Young excavated a fairly substantial portion of the mound. This is an actual balloon photo from the late 1980s. And you can see here that he did quite a bit of work, and in many ways we're still playing catch up with all of the excavations taking place there. One of the really welcome changes at Gordion has been a steady increase in publications. And for those of you who wish to learn more about Gordion, there's a series of new larger special studies, including numbers of joint conference papers that have been published. And for those who are interested in the objects, we're finally getting around to special studies on those. In fact, appearing just this month is Janet Jones' Gordion glass vessels, a long-awaited publication. It arrived in the mail just as I was leaving for the airport. I didn't even get to open it. I'm looking forward to it when I get home. We have spent a great amount of time on site preservation and presentation. I remember when I first started working at Gordion, there was a guidebook that said, Gordion is a site that only an archaeologist could love. And it was right. It was right. The site badly needed to be reconstructed. And this has been a significant focus of the site work over the last 20 years, beginning with Ken Sams. And we have a wonderful website for those who would like to learn more about pretty much every period at Gordion. So we really have made a lot of advances. And one thing we do know, of course, is that the site has a very, very long span of occupation. And we're more than just what many people think of when they think of Gordion, and I'm saying the early Iron Age. Of course, the site is best known for the Midas tumulus and for the semi-legendary King Midas. And people still visit the mound today and look at what is, I believe, still the oldest standing wooden building in the world. It's really quite fabulous. And my students all learn about Alexander visiting the site and the adventure of the Gordian knot. And this is, of course, what many people find they link to Gordian. My interests were in a later period. And that put me in a little bit of a different group of people working at Gordion. And I've learned quite a bit from people like Mary Voigt, who I worked with very closely for many years. And I'm going to try to present something a little different tonight, and some of it has to do with what we've experienced at Gordion. And this is, of course, the continuing problem that we have at many sites across the Mediterranean, in classical archaeology in particular, with our sort of problem of textual and archaeological sources. And I would just say that at Gordion, our textual sources are quite slim. You can see here in the lower left what is the newly discovered in 2021 Phrygian inscription, which is the first that we've ever found to actually name the site as Gordion. We really don't have many inscriptions from the site at all, and we don't have very many literary descriptions, certainly nothing contemporary. We had many older ones, and the problem had been is that Rodney Young, the original excavator, tended to give a bit more currency to the historical framework as he was trying to understand this site, which had very little clues to it. This was in the 1950s and 60s, and it made sense. But what we're trying to do now, I think, is something that is a little bit more careful at Gordion, and the reason stems from a recent change, of course, a massive change in our understanding of Iron Age Gordion. This is old news for some people, but Rodney Young had dated, largely on the basis of textual sources, the great destruction level at the site. He had dated it to around 700 BC, which was around the time of the purported death of Midas, also an invasion of the Cimmerians, and all of this came together to create a very useful narrative to explain what was a massive destroyed Phrygian citadel with just tremendous amounts of cultural material. And we're still working to publish this, although I do know that we are finally getting towards that, and I believe soon we'll have a book out on the terrace buildings. And so we are moving forward on this, but it's been slow work. However, in 2001, my colleague Mary Voigt re-excavated part of the terrace buildings and recovered quite a lot of organic material, which was sent off to Heidelberg, and we received brand new dates, which completely changed our understanding of the destruction level and when it took place, pushing it back a century. And so one of the lessons, at least that I've learned at Gordion, is that we need to be very, very careful of our historical sources. And so I'm trying to present today the archaeological discoveries and perhaps correlate them to some larger activities that we know are going on in the area, and hopefully bring the two together in a way that gives precedence to neither, that the textual and the archaeological evidence are dependent, and hopefully that will yield us a more accurate story. And I think it's a good story, and I hope by the end of the talk tonight you'll find it convincing. Because we're going to start in 1950, which is when Rodney Young began, and he excavated on the Citadel Mound in 3 places, 2 of which he hit large amounts of Roman material. He was not interested in the Roman material. Actually, I learned that Rodney Young hated the Romans from some of his colleagues when I first started Gordion. I was told he would not even touch a Roman object because the Romans had destroyed his beloved Corinth, which is where he learned to dig. And I can understand that, but the Roman material was sort of shoved into the closet. And fortunately, it was waiting there for a young graduate student who was interested in the Roman town. And this is what we're talking about today then. We're moving down the chronological scale to a period of time that is much, much later, and it's one that we knew almost nothing about. In 1990, this is more or less just before I was starting, we knew almost nothing about Roman Gordion. What we did know was that there was a single literary description from Strabo, who essentially declared the site was a village, only slightly larger than those surrounding it. So we had a little literary reference, and it became canon at Gordion when talking about the Roman site to call it a hamlet or a village. The komai was the Greek word, and so when I asked about Roman Gordion, people would say, "Oh, well, it's just a village." As I began to ask more questions, I began to find out that we really knew nothing about it at all in any detail. We didn't know anything about its size. We didn't know when the Romans were there. People had suggested, because of Strabo's dates, that it was the time of the annexation of the province here, Galatia. But we didn't know that. We had no idea what its function was. Was it a village? Or anything about the economy or the type of population. I was interested in the time about learning about villages in Galatia, and that's the one thing we did know. We knew that the site was located in a massive province across central Turkey known as Galatia, and that Gordion lay along a major transportation route between two of its largest cities, Pessinus and Ankara. The site therefore had some real promise. I thought, okay, it's a village, but it's alongside a major road, so maybe there's a market. Maybe we can tell what kinds of goods are flowing through this, learn about village life. For those of you who have been to central Anatolia, you know that village life, perhaps not so much in the 21st century, but even to the end of the 20th century, was everywhere. Many people still living in small villages. And so I thought this could be a wonderful thing to learn about. We actually know exactly where this road is. People have walked the route. And in fact, if you go to Google Earth, which is where this is from, we know that a milestone was discovered down by the old village of Mulk in a neighboring valley. And if you look closely on Google Earth, you can actually trace the course of the road. It's a perfect line. It goes all the way across the fields. It cuts across this very dry plateau. And people have actually walked parts of it. I've never been able to find it myself, but it really came at the end of my work there. And someday I'd like to go back and see if I can ground truth it. We do know that where it was from Gordion, because portions of it were excavated in 1955 and 1957. And it's a classic Roman road with a spina down the middle. It's about 6 meters wide, so it's a two-lane highway, if you would, and beautiful marginaes along the edge. It's quite well constructed. So the road did exist, was very clear, and so I began to work on Roman Gordion, and it's been many decades, maybe too many decades, but there was a great deal of information to bring together. The first was this large amount of what we refer to today as legacy data, which was gathered by Rodney Young, and he worked on the Roman settlement, or his supervisors found portions of it, especially in 1950 and in 1973. I was finding all kinds of wonderful things in the archives, and it began to set off some alarm bells because I realized that this purported village was actually much more complicated than one had suspected. In fact, one drawing that I found immediately showed beautifully designed houses, a colonnaded street, what seemed to be quite an organized settlement. And I began to wonder, well, are these Roman colonists? There were all kinds of issues that I had, and yet were very difficult to answer. So the next step was to begin to work with the excavator at the time, Dr. Mary Voigt, who welcomed me to her team. And between 1993 and 2005, the two of us excavated different portions of the Roman settlement. And so this provided a lot of new data and really has changed what we think of the site. In 2004, 2005, I led the first excavations that targeted specifically the Roman settlement based on Roman buildings that we knew of. And I worked in 3 different places with a wonderful team of people from Bill Kent University, Gene Greenhall, Julian Bennett, the late Julian Bennett, who I got a great deal of advice on the Romans. And we were able to learn quite a bit about how the settlement grew over time. There was also field survey going on, the Gordion Regional Survey by Lisa Kellifer, and we've gathered quite a bit of evidence about what the Romans were doing outside the site. And then we, of course, collected enormous amounts of data, including some wonderful archaeobotanical and faunal remains, which has been worked on by Mac Marston and Naomi Miller and others. So we really did have quite a lot of new data. And then there were a few wonderful chance finds that popped up over the years, which I'll show you tonight. And they were the ones that really put me on track of what was going on here. The first was in 1997, and I was very generously allowed by the Ankara Museum to publish this in their in-house journal. It's an 8-line Latin stele. It's a funerary stele for a soldier named Tritus, who was apparently stationed there or nearby, a Pannonian by birth. And he served for about 12 years in the Roman army, joining up at the age of 20. He lived to 32 years. So he never completed his term of service. He died far from home out in central Anatolia. And he was buried by his friend Mersua, son of Dazius. These are all really nice Pannonian names. And so we have this wonderful monument. You can see it. I'm not sure if it's on display at the Gordion Museum, but the red paint in the letters was still intact. It was in beautiful shape. In addition to this, in 2008, the Sakarya River lost a lot of water. And of course, when that happens, objects begin to appear. As you can see in the upper left here, several large altars were seen. An effort was made to grab these, to lift them, to bring them to the museum and to begin to clean them. A very large job, but the rewards were great. We have 2 inscribed Roman altars. They are inscribed to the Emperor Caracalla and to his brother Geta. But we know that Geta, who was killed by his brother about 6 months later, and then had his name erased, what we call damnatio memoriae. And you can actually see where Geta's name has been chiseled out of these altars. So we can give a very exact date to when these altars were carved, or at least when the inscriptions were carved, probably around 211 or 212. So this was quite a wonderful find, and the conservators and I offered our thanks to Fortuna for what was really a wonderful find. We had a lot of fun with this. No teddy bears were harmed, but they were fun to work with. We started digging in 2004, and on day 3, we came down on a large pile of metal, broken metal bits, including some large pottery like this mortarium. This is further down in the pile, but literally it was about 10 to 15 centimeters below the surface. Nearby, we also found other chunks of iron in the same building. You can see here in the lower photograph what it looked like. I'm a rather timid excavator sometimes. I worry about these things, so I called Cricket Harbor and our conservators. They took it to the lab, and for about 2 weeks, I didn't hear anything till Julian Bennett came up to me and handed me a very cold FS beer and said, "We found the soldiers." Because once cleaned, what this turned out to be was a set of about 11 scales held together by copper or bronze wire. These are typical Roman armor scales, datable to the 1st century or early 2nd century CE. And very clearly we had them. And in fact, once we began to clean the material from the piles, we found arrowheads, we found more, actually even bronze bronze armor. We found ring mail, those little round circles. We found thousands of them just dumped into this pile, and really quite remarkable. So Strabo, not a village. We had something very different here. If there was a village, this was certainly not something that Strabo was talking about. One of my favorite pieces, and I owe Gareth Derbyshire a shout out. I wasn't entirely sure what it was. I thought maybe it was calipers, but as it turns out, it's actually what's known as a sword chape. In order to stop you from sticking your feet with the sword, they had these sort of pegged ends. And this is a very simple one. It's not one of the beautiful ones that you see out of Germany, for example, but it very clearly had this function, creating a bracket to hold the sword. So we really had all kinds of evidence for soldiers at the site. And so we really needed to really rethink what Roman Gordion was, what these people were doing. And ultimately then, our new picture of Roman Gordion by 2024 is, I think, a very good one. And we have a lot of evidence to back this up. We now know that the site is roughly 3 hectares in size at its largest extent, which was more or less what you would need for an army camp for about 500 soldiers of mixed cavalry and military. We now know that the site was inhabited probably beginning around 50 CE, based on some sealed deposits we have, and continued, sometimes interrupted, all the way to the 5th century. We understand its function now, which was largely, if not entirely, as a military base. We have learned a great deal about its agricultural and pastoral economy, which I'll talk about a little later. And we know a lot more about its population, clearly soldiers and their families, because in the cemeteries, and we've excavated 3 cemeteries, 2 of which date to the Roman camp, we have many, many bodies of children and women. This is clearly a military community, and it fits very much with the picture of military communities that are being studied today. It's a very robust new field of military history, trying to understand the Roman army's communities, especially those out in places like Gordion, quite a rural area, that these people did bring their families, or created families while they were there, and they lived together at the site. So what we believe it is now, and I'm not the first to have created this suggestion, actually, David French was the first to publish this idea in 1973. But Galatia was Vindia, a statio or posting and communications station that we know existed along the Ankara-Pessinus highway. And it was in the nearby area of Gordion, but we now know that, we now believe, I think with a good amount of confidence, that Gordion is Vindia. We know a bit more about the life at the settlement. We know that it was rebuilt at least 4 times over the years, over a period of about 400 years. The material record shows that it was a moderately prosperous settlement. The soldiers were paid well, and they used that money to buy lovely objects, coming from a deep pit, a sealed deposit. So we know that this is probably in the second half of the 1st century, was a lovely Flavian style goblet. You can see what's a close but not perfect parallel for the Corning Museum of Glass that Janet Jones pointed out. And so you can see they had really lovely, delicate pieces. There was also, as I said, 3 large cemeteries. We have 147 excavated Roman graves, and they show a remarkable community. Children were buried with small objects like bells and mirrors. I mean, it was a community that was really quite robust. So as isolated as it is, it turned out to have quite a lovely history and a wonderful story that we uncovered. So over the past 8 months, I have finally finished the manuscript for Roman Gordion, and I'm pulling together the illustrations, and soon it will be off to the publication. But while I was buried into doing this, I discovered several new questions that I thought I could just mention today. Three questions. I think they will sort of lie at the heart of our story, which is why are they even there? Because ultimately, this is what we want to know. And frankly, our literary sources don't tell us anything. The archaeology tells us, I think, a very interesting story, and that's what I'll tell you today, and perhaps we can decipher it a little. First of all, it's the middle of the first century CE. There's a peaceful time in central Turkey. There's absolutely no aggression going on, and yet they're posting these soldiers all the way out at a time that ostensibly, many more soldiers are out on the limes, the borders of the Roman Empire. You can see here all the legions plus many of the auxiliary troops, and Galatia, as you can see, is not even close. It was what the ancient historian Tacitus called an unarmed province. That means there were very, very few soldiers in it at any time. So to find soldiers at Gordion is actually quite something. There are many soldiers, of course, along the Euphrates frontier. We have at least 3 large legionary bases and many auxiliary bases. And Gordion, meanwhile, is hundreds of kilometers inland. And so the site itself is an interesting one. Now, we believe, and it's almost certainly correct, that these were Roman auxiliaries. And if you're not familiar with this, they're a kind of a second tier of soldier who, well, they don't get as paid as well. In order to join, you can have Roman citizenship, but it was rare. For the most part, these were non-Roman citizens who, after 25 years of service, would receive Roman citizenship. So these people are willing to go out into these rather desolate places to serve the Roman world. The rewards were tangible. And the Roman security apparatus needed them. They needed them to keep the roads safe. They needed them to have communications inside the province. These are all quite important. Gordion does not have fortifications, and it makes it a rare example, therefore, of a Roman fort. But it's in an unarmed province where fortifications weren't needed. And at Gordion, of course, we have the old fortifications. By the Roman period, about a meter of soil had built up. But the old fortifications were still there. And they could very well have chosen Gordion because they didn't have to put as much time and resources into using this particular site. It's on a high mound, for those of you who have been there. Today, it's 16 meters above the floodplain, but back then it was probably 20 or more meters above, making it even higher and less approachable. So the garrison would have been doing the kinds of work that these garrisons did all across the Roman Empire. And this is the first such site we found in Turkey, but we know them from many places, especially in Britain and in Germany. So we know that they were probably there to protect the road, to collect taxes, what was essentially a mundane yet essential job for these Romans and the government. And, it probably wouldn't have been exciting, but you probably would have been part of a very large machine, a small part, but one that was essential for the Roman world to work. And so the conclusion that we've reached is that Gordion was Vindia, and as a statio, it performed these kinds of duties out in central Anatolia. Now, my home state of Washington has a similar kind of situation where we have it's actually very much like central Anatolia. When you're in central Washington, it even looks like the area around Gordion. The green stars here are the large cities. As you can see, there are not many of them. The yellow stars are the Washington State Patrol bases, which have been placed in areas where these people can help and provide the kinds of government presence that isn't necessarily found out in what is a large area, a fairly large state without a great many people in certain areas. And so in many ways, we have a similar kind of experience at home. And even in Yasahuyuk, we have a gendarme station. I've seen these young soldiers for many, many years. They're completely bored out of their minds. They've been posted there in Yasuhuyuk where there's really nothing to do. And it's always presented me a bit of a picture of what the Roman soldiers might have been like, except that they get to be there with their families. And they get to be part of a community. So I think the Romans actually have it much better than what many of these folks did. All right. So this is our site located along the road, probably Vindia. Now, one of the things that we have learned through testing of the and examination of the faunal and plant remains, and I'm very, very grateful to my colleagues for their work on this, is that we know that the whole area appears to have been used for growing very, very high quality red wheat. And this is the kind of wheat that the Roman soldiers would eat, the best quality. And it was probably being sent in lieu of taxes in order to feed the armies out on the Euphrates border. And the idea is, of course, that central Anatolia, much like it is today, if you drive through it, is a giant grain basket. And they're growing the best kinds of food, and they're sending it out. What's really interesting too, though, and I think perhaps more so, is the faunal remains. What we found is, or Janar Çakılar found, was that the troops seem to have, we have a number of animals on site, and the troops seem to have been provided with young cows and young pigs to eat for their own food. And also sometimes some fowl like duck. Was a beautiful little duck bill that we found. I love this particular find. But more important, there's like a 3-to-1 ratio. It's mostly sheep and goats. And these all turn out to be much, much older animals. And what my colleagues have proposed is that these older animals were being used to provide products like wool and milk and perhaps cheese. And these also were being sent off to, probably sent off to the limes, with the understanding that they finally get to be eaten when they're no longer, in such great shape. But that they were kept for many years in order to be used pastorally. And what we seem to have here is a fascinating glimpse into what is a kind of a military agricultural network, where what they're doing is not just protecting the roads and creating communications, but creating bonds with the shepherds and the farmers, and working together. I mean, the local people were probably not all that pleased that these soldiers were there, but nevertheless, it did provide a constant market of enormous amounts of produce, which had to be shipped out to the border. And I think what is going on here is that the base is created in the middle of the first century CE because of Nero's Parthian War, which was a massive, very long 5-year conflict taking place out to the east of the Euphrates. You need a supply chain that will work. Gordion is located even off the map, and it's not anywhere close, but it would have been in one of the agriculturally prosperous regions where supplies could be gathered on a regular basis. And so my colleague Julian Bennett has established, probably on the basis of the number of known soldiers in the area, maybe 20,000, maybe 3,000 horses as well in our province here, that they would have needed enormous amounts of material on a monthly basis. Over 500,000 kilograms of wheat, 30,000 kilograms of meat, large amounts of wine and olive oil. And of course, for the animals, you need fodder. So barley probably was being grown as well, just as it is in central Anatolia today. So the reason for these kinds of networking going on between the locals and the soldiers was probably deeply rooted in the needs of the Roman army. So that's why I think they're there at Gordion. All right. So who are they? Because I'm sure some of them were recruited locals, but I guess the big question we have to ask is, where do these soldiers come from? They just appear, and there are many of them, and they're living on a site that is not small. It's about a third of the surface of the Citadel Mound, as I said, the buildings are quite well made. One of the And this is a little embarrassing, one of the latest discoveries we made, we didn't really understand this till about, I think it was about 2009 or 2010. I was sitting with Mary Voigt and I said, these buildings look really very regular. And we began to graph it out using pencil and ruler, old school. And what we realized was that these buildings were not only carefully planned, but there was probably an architectural engineer who was in charge of these. Now, if you know anything about ancient measurements, a Roman foot is about 30 centimeters, and 10 Roman feet is about 3 meters. And we call this a decam, or I should say, they call this a decampedia. And this is a known measure which was used by Roman armies and soldiers and those building aqueducts and various other structures. And what happened was we began graphing it out. And we found that everything on the site is a fraction of 5 Roman feet. It's not perfect, as most buildings aren't, but it's very, very close. In a few areas, it's a little off, but clearly this whole camp, and this is the third iteration of it, was planned out in advance and very, very carefully. So we know whoever came in with tremendous resources. We've also found various objects which seem to be coming from Central Europe or Western Europe. This is a snake's head brooch with wonderful enameling. Sadly, it was found in a parking lot on the surface, but it did arrive at the site, probably from long distance. In our cemeteries, we found some very odd things. This was the grave had been completely looted except for the lower leg bones and a perfectly preserved pair of hobnail boots. This was found in the early 1960s over by the Gordion Museum. And so the person is wearing a pair of boots, but there's a second pair set upright next to them. So for many, many years, I have been scattering the literature of Pannonia. I figured if we have a tombstone, this is perhaps the best place we could go. And in fact, it has yielded some very interesting clues. And we know for the various wars that soldiers were brought from the Danube and the Rhine Limes, particularly up here in Pannonia, and shuffled across until they reached Syria and could be placed to fight in places like Mesopotamia. This is particularly true for Trajan's Parthian War, which had the largest army ever assembled under the Romans, somewhere between 160 and 180,000 men on a 4-year expedition. This is probably where Tritus was from. And he probably died as part of this expedition. Going into sites in Pannonia, we find pottery that has some remarkable similarities to that which is found there. One of the graves had a very interesting, and I actually excavated this myself. This was one of the first graves I'd ever excavated. We did have the upper body, I'll show you that later, but it was excavated in 2 seasons, and so I got the legs. And we found this bundle of all kinds of small objects together. It turned out to be a little bit too small for a necklace and too large for an anklet. It was found by the ankles, and that's what we thought it was early on. But we did find a large tab of amber, which is the dried rectangular piece you can see on the right in the middle, and then a beautiful little bird that was on a little iron. It fell off, but it was on a little iron plaque, and a lot of glass beads. Well, my hunt for Comparanda led me once again back to Pannonia. And along the Danube, I found a wonderful site, a cemetery filled with 27 women, all of whom had at their feet large amounts of beads. And this was very very interesting because the Pannonian women would wear these large belts, and hanging down from them were these strings of beads and bells and all kinds of things, maybe apotropaic to keep away spirits. But this was part of the native costume. And we seem to have something relating to that at the Gordian site, this very odd charm bracelet type of thing. We also noticed, and it's hard to see in this photo, remember this is from 1994, so we didn't have digital cameras, but you can see on the skull some staining. It's a brownish red. And so we seem to think that she very well might have been wearing, yeah, and we have a lot of skeletons, so this is very unusual. But we think that she might have been wearing some kind of headgear. And we do know that Pannonian women would wear these. There were not that many women into hats back in the Roman Empire, but they were very well known at Noricum and in Pannonia for this local costume. So she was 18 to 21 years old, and she seems to have come along perhaps with the troops. She might have been buried wearing some of her native objects. We really don't know. We have not done DNA testing on this, and it was just too expensive when I was doing this work. But I think we have some interesting clues. Last clue, actually, just a little further down the Danube, at a site called Osijek. There is a whole series of graves where the boots are placed next to the bodies. And so it's not a slam dunk, as we would say in the United States, but I can say that I have found a good deal of comparanda from that particular region. And I think it's a good bet to say that at least some of these people coming to the site and buried there were possibly from Pannonia, and certainly from Central Europe. Last question, and this was the greatest mystery of all. And my colleague Gene Greenhall found this, and for years I have been unable to answer this question. So I'm going to offer a little bit of a hypothesis to end the talk tonight, and that has to do with the last residents of Roman Gordion, who built these large pit houses, semi-subterranean houses of a type we do not find in the Roman period, but suddenly appear just after the Roman buildings are abandoned. Rodney Young found a very large Roman cemetery above his buildings, about 64 graves, and it was not entirely clear to whom these belonged, because they were perched above the last set of really nice Roman buildings, and those buildings seem to have abandoned around 350. So, they're dug right into the floors of these buildings, so not much time had passed when these were buried. Down here in Op 53, we were surprised to find not the last set of Roman buildings, but a very large pit house. Goes right up to the line of the 1950 excavation, and we know Rodney Young found little pieces of it, but never identified this particular stratum. So it's a brand new stratum at Gordion. And it's really quite an amazing building. The floor was just filled with all kinds of features. Including some wonderful tripod holes that I'll show you in a second, all kinds of cook holes. It's a very complex building, and it was in tremendous shape, but it had been completely emptied of all objects. We found 12 small pieces of pottery, and in examining them, they all belonged to the pre-Roman period. So we had no idea who was living here. Whoever left cleaned the building, and then the roof collapsed, and it was abandoned. So we just didn't have any idea. Here you can see some of the wonderful things on the floor. You can see in the upper left a cook hole and probably a post hole as well. In the bottom here are several of these small groups of these triple sets of holes, which very likely held tripods. They were right up against the wall, and maybe not all of them, but I can guarantee you they're real. We weren't making them. Anyways. I have been bedeviled by the question of who these people were, because we know that it's after the Romans left the site around 350, at least, and it's before the Celtic Ottoman village that probably started in the 11th century. It has to fall somewhere in there. And if we believe that the cemetery is part of this, then it has to have occurred in late antiquity, perhaps the early Byzantine period. My possible solution that I throw out to you, and if anybody has any comments on this, I'm all ears, is that these people are the Goths. Now, I had always felt that the barbarian migrations had bypassed central Anatolia. But we do have some evidence that at least two tribes, the Ostrogoths and the Greuthungians, who belong to a group called the Chernyankov people, that these people moved into Phrygia. So I had always kind of thought, well, nobody came to this side of the Aegean. But as it turns out, and moving into a period I don't know that much about, I was able to find that we're told that a small number of them settled in Phrygia, probably originally from the northern Black Sea area. This is a well-known people. They changed quite a bit over time, and we do know that they began to migrate as the Huns moved into the Black Sea region. Like so many people, they chose to try to move into the Roman Empire. And we have a number of objects from outside the pit house, from contexts that seem contemporary, which appear to belong to the people living in the houses, including a spearhead, as well as several pieces of pottery, which can be dated as late antique forms, anywhere between the 5th and 7th century. So what I think is going on here, and again, our evidence is tentative at this point, is that they belong to a group of Phrygians who were following a leader named Tribigeld, whom we are told by the late antique poet Claudian settled in Phrygia around 386. The Ostrogoths don't always get along with each other, and I think the idea was to sort of separate them like unruly kids and move some out to Phrygia. And we know that he then left in 399 to try to attack Pisidia and Pamphylia. And his army is defeated and destroyed. And so this could be a reason why no one came back. And so our current hypothesis is that the Goths might have been brought to Gordion by the rulers of Constantinople at the time, with the understanding that they could both be settlers as well as act as mercenaries to control the site. And we do know that they did this kind of work across the Roman Empire, particularly along the Danube area. So this is my suggestion. If so, it would mean that we have the first Gothic settlement ever identified in Turkey. Again, it's tentative, but I think we have a shot. So 3 new questions turn to possibly 3 new answers. The Roman soldiers posted at Gordion in 50 BC were there both to support the borders and the wars, enforce security, and to keep the great Roman peace, the Pax Romana. The soldiers, probably at least some of them, did seem to have moved all the way from Central Europe, brought over to be part of this road crew, particularly in the early 2nd century. That's when our best evidence has, quite possibly from Pannonia. And the last people in antiquity to live at Gordion were possibly the Goths, maybe settled for the same reasons that the Romans were there, to both protect these highways and to take over the duties of the former residents at the site. I'll leave you with one final thought. And I've thought a lot about this recently, and I'm not sure I'm going to include it in Roman Gordion, but we have had over the last decade an increasing amount of evidence to show military activity at Gordion. For example, in 2019, this beautiful bronze breastplate was recovered. I've never seen it in person, but the photographs are stunning. And then in 2021, we have the new inscription, which not only names Gordion, but says that posted at the site was a squad of troops from Pergamum. And the excavations by Mary Voigt in the northwest zone revealed a massive fortification wall of the middle Hellenistic period when we dug it in the early 1990s with the team from Canada. And the result is that I think the Romans are simply following a long tradition, really reaching all the way back to the 6th century and the Persians, of regarding Gordion not as a capital city, but instead as a very strategically important military base, one that should be manned, one that watched many important waterways and valleys, and that this simply continued among the Romans as part of a long tradition, maybe even extending as far as the Goths, who would be given something similar here. So I think we need to stop always thinking about Gordion as the great Iron Age Phrygian city. And I think we should consider that Gordion for 900, 1,000 years acted as a major military site, one which people regarded and inhabited again and again and again, quite possibly for the same reasons the Romans did, to provide stability in central Anatolia out in this rural district. Again, my thanks for inviting me to speak with you this evening. I have very much enjoyed getting to finally set the record straight after 28 years of my first talk here at ERIT. I would love to hear your questions. Thank you all for coming.